Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into suicide prevention. And so this has kind of become an annual episode for us because it is really important. I don't think there's anything more important in this world than somebody's life. And there are a few things in this world less tragic than somebody getting so hopeless that they don't see a way out and they decide to end their life. So, suicide prevention is a very big deal. And we're going to start off by talking about signs of suicidality. So, what to look for in terms of somebody being suicidal.
Right. And I just want to say at the start, I was thinking about how for most therapists, I think I can make this general statement. When you have a client who is suicidal, often the therapist doesn't even know what to do. I mean,
Wow.
it's really hard
Yeah.
because even though there's a lot of training, I think it's that, you see this person in front of you and you have this relationship with them and you have a strong emotional reaction to
Hmm.
them saying, I want to end my life or I'm thinking about ending my life. And so I think that for, people in families, if you had a family member or friend who, expressed suicide ideation, I think that'd be very, very hard to hear. And I think often
Yeah.
people don't know what to do. And we'll get to that later about what you do. But so I think certainly the first thing is you have to be aware. And so I think to start is to be aware of what I would call small changes in people's affect. And I've mentioned that before in terms of couples, because as Gottman points out, it's one of those things that really is good for couples is to be aware in what are the changes, small emotional changes that you see in the other person. Now, to
Mm.
do that, you have to be aware, though, and you have to be really present, with
Hmm.
the other person. And so just being aware of that is the first step, but then listening. And, they may say, I'm going to kill myself. They may be very direct about it.
Right.
They may say it a little indirectly. I wish I were dead, or I wish I wasn't born. That type of thing that says they don't want to be around. I think also to pay attention as far as are they acquiring means to do it? Like, did they buy a gun? Would that be unusual for someone if they, had never owned a gun before? I think if you're living with someone who is taking some sort of medication that might be used,
Hmm.
to kill themselves with an overdose. And then that goes along with paying attention to what they're saying. Then I think you need to look at the pills and you need to make sure that they aren't, stockpiling pills. So, being aware of what's going on in the home or even with your friends. Now it's harder with your friends because you typically wouldn't see,
Right.
if they bought a gun, unless they told you or if they were stockpiling pills. I think that with social media now,
Hmm.
I think it's pretty well, I don't know. I don't do social media. You tell me if it's common. That there might be people out there who talk or write about it, who write about death, or
Hmm.
who are throwing things out, I want to die, or, I wish I hadn't been born. I would guess there are some people who are doing or throwing that out on social media. Do you think that's true?
I haven't seen it. But I mean, I could see it happening. I mean, I think people sometimes maybe overestimate the reach of social media, or, maybe they're just so desperate to feel seen and heard that they might throw that out there just to see what would happen. And that's really what I could see it happening is I wonder if anybody really cares about me. So what are people going to say if I throw this out on social media? That I could definitely
Right.
see someone doing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. Increased use of alcohol or drugs, something that's unusual for that person, doing risky or self-destructive behaviors. I think in the extreme, someone could start giving away belongings or saying they're getting their affairs in order, saying final goodbyes to people, things like that. And we have to pay attention to those things. And I think the important thing is don't ignore them. I
Yes.
think it might be easy, going back to what I said at first, that being with someone who wants to kill themselves, I think is very hard.
Yes.
And so we might, think, oh, I'll just ignore that. Or maybe we probably wouldn't think that, consciously, but we might just kind of put it aside saying, I'm not going to deal with that. I think that's a mistake. I think if we see something that we're worried about, we need to address it. We need to talk about
And, it could even just be something as simple as, I've noticed this. Tell me what's going on, or tell me how you're feeling. Tell me how you're coping with this, because I've noticed this different behavior in you. And oftentimes they'll start to say things like, well, it's been really tough, or things have just been so hard, or I feel like I'm not coping well. And if they're really kind of beating around the bush, or if they're hesitant, sometimes you just need to bluntly say to them, "Do you wanna die?" Like,
it. Right.
sometimes you can just ask that, and, that might seem like overkill, but in terms of suicide prevention, it's pretty hard to overdo it.
Right. And I think it's important for people not to be afraid to address it directly. Uh,
Yes.
but I also think, if we're paying attention, like if we're in a family and more emotionally intimate relationships, or even with a close friend, and we know they are involved or in a situation where they might feel hopeless.
Mhm.
So I think, paying attention to what's going on in their lives, because often we can tell, or like we can even use our empathy. I would
Yeah.
feel hopeless if I were in that situation. And
Yeah.
so you can think, well, I'm wondering if they're feeling hopeless. So I think you're right that don't be afraid to address it, and don't be afraid to ask those questions, because some people are afraid that if I say something, are you thinking of killing yourself? That
Mhm.
somehow that either gives them the idea to do it, or increases the likelihood that they will do it. And that's just not true. It's
No.
it's not true at all. And so addressing it directly is an important step.
Yes, and this also kind of fits in well with another thing that I like to bring up, that so many people confuse validation for "I agree with you."
Right.
So oftentimes, if a family member's, if you ask, "Do you wanna die?" and then they say, "Actually, yeah, I do." I mean, first of all, be prepared for an internal shock, because,
Mhm. Right.
that's gonna be devastating. And so the first thing you're gonna wanna do your best to do is try to temper your reaction, because if you just say, "No, no, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that," you know, that's sending a message to them that I can't handle your big emotion that you're feeling.
Right. And it also invalidates whatever it is that's going on in their life. And
Yes.
so, this goes back to some of those skills that we've talked about in many, many episodes, as far as,
Mhm.
listening and understanding and having the validation and the empathy. And so to really listen, because often I think someone who's hopeless, what they want maybe is just someone to listen to them,
Yeah.
and to really understand what their life situation is. And the only way you can do that is to really get into it and follow their emotion, and to be able to say, so this is the validation,
Mhm.
be able to say, I understand the reason you would want to kill yourself or to take your own life. And
Yeah.
so, and then I would say, I would add this, I don't think that's a good choice,
Yes.
and let's talk about what other choices you have. But I think just hearing them and then being able to say, I get it,
Mhm.
is really helpful, because then they don't feel so alone. And it goes back to what we talked about in our mental health mini, is that not strengthening family connections or strengthening friend connections so that the
Mhm.
person doesn't feel so alone, is a good way to help someone who might have that suicidal ideation.
So I think if somebody answers yes to this question, "Do you wanna die?" I think the next best question is to calmly say, "Do you have a plan?"
Right. And I mean, there's no right or wrong as to when you do that. I think I'd probably
Sure.
go into a little more detail of what's going on in your life. So I'd
Okay,
want
yeah.
so before I went to tell me what you're going to do, but so I want to say that is an important question.
Mhm.
I think for me, I would probably delay it just a little bit, because I'd want to get into the emotion.
Mhm.
I'd really want them to know that I can hear them and I understand the reason they're hopeless. And then a good question would be, do you have a plan?
Yeah.
And so that's one of those things that you have to pay attention to. And so you're going to get usually two responses. No, I don't have a plan. Yes, I do have a plan. The
Right.
yes, I do have a plan, you have to be really pay attention to that, be really careful. And that is really a different avenue of helping the person other than, no, I don't have a plan. Because then, to me anyway, that says that attempting the suicide is not really imminent. It's they're thinking about it, they're feeling hopeless, they've had that suicidal ideation. If they have a plan, they've gone down that road,
Yeah.
a couple of steps further, and that is
Hmm.
serious. So there's a difference in how they answer that. One is very serious. The other is, I think you probably need more dialogue and more support.
Yeah. And
That's
if
all.
they, yeah, and I agree. If they have a plan, then I would really start to encourage them to seek immediate help. Right.
But
So,
you may have to help them do that. I wouldn't leave them
yes,
alone.
yes.
So we have two choices as to, well, a couple of choices. One would be to call 911. So
Hmm.
911 is the emergency if you feel like they are going to hurt themselves soon, or if you're really worried for their safety,
Yeah.
then you probably call 911
Yeah.
as opposed to 988. And
Hmm.
so the 988 might be helpful in that sense that if they haven't got a plan and you don't fear for their safety, but they need that support. It can
Hmm.
come from you, it can come from someone on the helpline. But if you feel like they're close, like having a plan, to me, feels close, then I think you
Yeah.
need help. Now the other choice is you can take them to a mental health facility, like in a hospital. Now, a lot of people, I mean, even for me, that is a drastic step.
Yeah.
And I don't typically deal in my practice with people who are suicidal,
Hmm.
because of who I choose to do now. Someone like Lindy and Adrian have a different client base, and they sometimes have those clients, but it doesn't happen with me very often. But the couple of times it has, and I have recommended that they go check themselves in. That is a hard thing to say, but
Yeah.
it is the right thing to say because it keeps them safe.
Hmm. Yes.
And I think that if you, want a primary goal when you're talking to someone who's suicidal, is to keep them safe. And so you have
Hmm.
to figure out what that is. And I think having ideas, so calling 911 is one idea. Now, the problem with, I don't know if this is a problem, the police are going to come.
Yes.
Now, I think police departments are trying to do a better job
Yeah.
of getting some training, to deal with people who are suicidal. I
Yeah.
think there are sadly some police officers who don't have adequate training, and they may not approach it in the best way. And so you have to be aware of that. And it's a hard decision because you aren't going to know who you're going to get. I think some police departments actually have people who are specific to do this, who have extra training, who would come. Either they come with the police officer or they're the ones who show up.
Right. And so I have heard this before and it's absolutely heartbreaking, but I have heard somebody say to me before, I will not call 911 because I am afraid of getting shot.
And sadly, that happens.
It
I
does.
mean, it happens here. It's not unusual to have someone who is suicidal and then something happens and they get shot.
Yeah.
The police may feel threatened in some
Yeah.
way. It's not that they're just going in and shooting people, but they
Yeah.
may feel threatened because I think people who are suicidal, people who have gone down that road, the extra step to have a plan, I
Hmm.
think they aren't thinking very clearly.
Right. And I want to be clear about that I am not trying to be anti-police or blame the police because that is just an incredibly tough, hard situation. I mean, if somebody has a means of hurting themselves or hurting other people and they are in the act or they are in the process of wanting to do that, that is a tough, dangerous situation. And these police officers, again, we're getting better at it and we need to do better. And, I know that the police are trying, but I also want to acknowledge that for police officers, that is such a hard situation. Police officers don't go into that line of work because they want to carry a gun and use it. That's not what they are doing. They do it because they want to protect and they want to serve. The majority, right? I mean, I won't pretend there aren't police officers out there that, like the power, but no officer, at least I hope there aren't any officers out there who are just hoping that they get to be involved in some sort of firearm incident, right? And so, I want to be clear about that.
Right. I don't want to blame the police either, but it's
Yeah.
something that happens. And then there
Yeah.
is a real thing that some people do called suicide by police.
Yes.
And so, if you really want to do it, you go out into the front yard of your house brandishing a gun, and that will happen. I mean,
And in that incident, I don't know what else you can
I, I
do.
I don't know that there's anything else that the police can do in that regard.
Yeah.
So,
I don't think there is. But again, is that any different than pulling the trigger yourself?
no, except that it's pretty traumatic for the police.
Exactly.
I
It's
mean,
almost worse. But again,
well,
people who feel who feel so hopeless, I think you were right in that they aren't thinking clearly. They aren't thinking straight. I mean, try to imagine the intense emotional pain that somebody has to get to that they don't want to be on this earth anymore. That has to be some serious, intense emotional pain that they feel like they can't get out of.
right. And so, again, I think that if that suicide by police just complicates it in so many ways, because I
Yeah.
think often police don't have an option, but it is traumatic for them. It's traumatic for the family. It's traumatic for the community, because then there are all sorts of accusations. Did the police need to do it? It just takes it to a whole different level when someone
Yeah.
does it. But it does happen. Um,
Yeah.
sometimes. And so the other thing, that if you have someone who is either got a plan, or even if they have that suicidal ideation, and I would do this even if they don't have a concrete plan, I
Yeah.
would say, well, do you have any weapons? Let's get the weapons out of the house. Do you have any pills? So you start checking in with what are the ways in which this might happen, and I'm going to help you take care of those things.
Hmm. So I was talking to a friend once who was really just struggling and she just felt like she couldn't get herself back up emotionally. She was really just struggling. She had kind of one thing happen after another. And I had asked her directly, "Do you want to die?" And she said no. And I double checked on this. But she just felt like she just was in this intense amount of emotional pain. And I said, "Okay, I want you to do one thing to help yourself feel better. You don't need to get to happy today. You don't need to get to 100% happy. You don't need to get yourself to all sunshine and roses. But I want you just to find and do one thing to just bring a little bit of happiness. Just one thing. And just try to focus there." And so it's this idea of trying to send them down this road of changing the narrative a little bit. And so, you start by, I'm going to validate, I can see that you're in this intense emotional pain. I certainly don't want you to die. I want to just find one thing, one small thing that you can do that's going to help you feel joy. We don't have to fix the pain. We don't have to take away all the pain. I'm not going to erase your pain. But if you can find one small, simple thing, let's just start there. Take one step.
Hmm. And I think it's important not to try and help the person on your own, if at all possible. I
Yeah.
think get either friends or family involved.
Hmm.
It's too big of a. I think it's too big of a thing emotionally to take
Yes.
on for yourself, and so you need that support. And I also think it's good for the person who is expressing that desire to commit suicide, is that if they see all these people rallying around them and have this support network, then I think it makes it much less likely that they'll follow through.
Yeah.
And so I think if you're the first one
Hmm.
who is talking to this person, then it's going to be up to you to gather a team together.
Hmm.
And it could be, it could be a therapist. It could be, other family members. Here's the other thing. If you know of a therapist, if you know the person has a therapist,
Hmm.
it can be tricky with the privacy laws with HIPAA. But
Mm.
here's what you can do. You can always call and give information. Do you
Okay.
see? That's not breaking any laws or ethics, and the therapist can listen to you.
Okay.
What So what is clear is the therapist can't give you information about the client
Okay.
with the client's permission, but you can always call or email or say, here's what's going on.
Hmm.
And to me, that's always helpful.
Okay. Yeah,
To
and
have-
that is, or even if,
that's okay.
and even if you know if they're at a specific center, like they're seeing it, they're going to a specific counseling center, you don't even have to know the therapist's name. I would imagine you
Right.
can call and
Right.
say, "Hey, I have this friend. I know they're being seen at your facility. I have this information." And
Mhm.
that whoever works at the center can then get that information to the counselor. Or if you know their doctor, that's also an option.
You mean like they're a physician, like an internist or something like that?
Yeah,
Uh,
like if they're their primary care physician, you could say, I don't know if this person is in counseling, but this is what we're dealing with. If
and it's good. It's just that they are limited as to what they can do. They would tell you just to take them to the hospital or call
okay.
one. One of the hard things with physicians is they don't get a lot of good training on this. I don't
Mm,
know that I would expect them to, though.
okay.
I
Yeah.
think that I think that their role is really to refer out to
Okay.
people
Yeah.
who are trained to, because they can't take care of everything with a person, the
Yeah.
well and the physical, and so they really ought to be able to refer out and have people. And most physicians do have someone that they refer to
Hmm.
if they have a patient who is suicidal.
Which makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, you have a pediatrician, they send their patients out to specialists all the time. I mean, if I
Right?
have cancer, I'm not going to go to an orthopedist to treat
No,
my cancer. I mean,
no, yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. So I think at the addressing it directly, don't be afraid to do it, and realize when you hear it at first, it is a shock,
Yeah.
and that's okay. But what you really want to do is be there for, at least initially,
Hmm.
support, understanding, the validation, the empathy, and then assess, do you have a
Yeah.
plan? Do
Hmm.
you have a means to do this? And if there is means, then you take care of it. And your primary goal is to make sure they're safe.
Yes. And you know that they're not alone
Right.
too,
Right.
if at all possible.
You need other people, like a team, because you
Yes.
can't be there all the time.
No.
But so I agree with you that was my point in saying form a team so that that person doesn't have to be alone. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even with 988. So
Yeah.
let's say the person who is suicidal doesn't want to call 988. If I were there with them, I would call 988 and I
Hmm.
would say, here's what's going on. What do you recommend? And
Yeah.
so often if you feel like you're at a loss as to what to
Hmm.
do, help is just, three digits away, 988.
Yeah.
And it's not that the person who is suicidal has to call them. You can call them. I can
Yeah.
call them and get help and say, what do you recommend? And so that can be helpful to know that you don't have to deal with this alone, because that can feel overwhelming to the person who's there.
Oh yeah, I mean it absolutely can. So one of the things that I always like to bring up when we talk about suicide prevention is the importance of locking up your guns
Yeah.
regardless. Part of being a responsible gun owner is having a lock. And so one of the main reasons is there's a lot of evidence that just the act of having to unlock a gun is often enough to slow people up to get them out of that suicidal ideation spiral. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, it does, because it does slow them up. It gives them time to think. But also, I mean, I agree, lock up your guns. But if the person who is suicidal, often that's like a number, or even I think high tech
Yeah.
fingerprint. I think sometimes you do have to remove the guns from the
Y-
house.
Yes, if
And
they, yes, yes, absolutely. But I mean, that's something that I always like to bring up, that as a responsible gun owner, have
yeah,
a lock on your gun.
yeah,
But yeah, if they are, again, if you've gone through that process and if they're really feeling suicidal, you say, well, can I hang on to your guns for you?
I would be even more direct. I would like to take your guns, as opposed to asking the question, or
Okay.
even, I'm going to take your guns to keep you safe.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
if they won't give you the guns, I
Hmm.
would call 911,
Okay.
because they're clearly thinking of something,
Yeah.
and you need to keep them safe. And
Yeah.
so, or call 988 to get ideas, but I wouldn't
Right.
let it go, I'd say,
Yeah.
well, I want to take your guns because it'll keep you safe.
Yeah, I mean, until we get this figured out, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, until you get to a safer place because
Right.
you're not safe and make it and and really try to stress and make it about my goal is to keep you safe and to say even to say, I don't want you to die.
Hmm.
Right? I mean, get to that point. Don't immediately jump to that because you don't want to just say, "Well, no, 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 that's a bad idea," because as we talked about, that can feel invalidating.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you definitely want to say, "I see that you are in an intense amount of pain." That can be so powerful just to see and recognize because oftentimes when people are feeling that hopeless, they feel alone and they feel like nobody else understands what they're going through. And you're
Mm.
not going to. Don't try to say, "Oh, I totally get what you're going through," but just say, "I see your pain. I see that you are really, really hurting."
Right. And you want to listen to them well enough that you can
Yes.
say, I get it. I get it from your perspective.
Yeah.
And so I can understand how you would want to end your life.
Yeah.
I want to help you to, stay safe right now until we figure this out. So I think it is a lot about letting them know you're there to support them and that you hear them and that you see the hopelessness
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
and
and
then keep them safe. So,
yes, yes. I mean, because, validating somebody's pain doesn't mean you agree with their desire to die.
right, right.
Saying, wow, that sounds absolutely terrible. That sounds
Yeah,
like an awful situation. I can understand why you feel so hopeless,
yeah,
but I mean, I want you to be around. And so, I'm going to help keep you safe because I don't want you to die
yeah.
is a good place to go.
Yep.
So, again, 988 if is the suicide prevention hotline. You can text or call that number. Texting is a great way for youth. Oftentimes, younger people, particularly teens, are more comfortable texting. And so that can also be a great outlet, especially if you have a teen and you're not sure what to do. You can always just say, "Here, text this person and talk to
Yeah,
them." So
yeah,
the point is getting them help because it's not something you just ignore. And it's uncomfortable. I think that that's another point to really reiterate is that suicide is uncomfortable. That was one other thing I wanted to ask you about. So if you talk to somebody or if you get through dealing with somebody who has been suicidal and you're just having a hard time processing it, would that be an appropriate time, even if you're not suicidal yourself, to call the suicide hotline and say, "Hey, I just dealt with this. I just need somebody to talk to about this"?
well, I think so. I think so.
Okay.
And if it's not, they would certainly tell you, where you might go. But I think process it with someone else is going to be really important. And it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a therapist, certainly, but
Yeah.
a family member, a friend. And what you're wanting from them is actually what you're giving to the person who was suicidal. You
Yes.
just want them to understand how difficult it was for you and how
Mhm.
emotionally it can be traumatic, how emotionally traumatic it was for you. And so you're just wanting to be seen,
Yes.
in that experience that you just had
Yeah.
with the person that was suicidal. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's another important part, talking that through with somebody, just getting it out, just saying, "I just went through this incredible experience and I'm just kind of reeling from it." Unload. Find that way to
Mm.
unload. That's an
Process,
important part.
process with someone. Yeah, I agree.
Yes. Yeah, processing it. Okay. So next week is going to be a really great episode. So the episode is going to be called Backpack to Rucksack. So we're going to have a special guest. His name is Dan Joseph. He is a retired combat engineer with the Army, and he had a soldier in his platoon survive a suicide attempt. So he wrote a book about it. And next week, I'm going to talk with him and we're going to talk about suicide prevention among soldiers, which is so important
That's important.
because that is another area where we are really lacking is caring for our veterans. I mean,
Yeah,
they gave this incredible service. And again, I know this isn't an easy problem because PTSD is really hard, especially for soldiers who see combat. I mean, that's a lot of can be physical trauma, but that's a lot of emotional and mental trauma.
yeah.
So I'm going to have a conversation with Dan Joseph about that. It's going to be a really good episode. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a good week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.